Thank you for joining us in This Week in Turkey. I am Murat, Türsan. We have to warn our audience in advance this evening, as tonight we are dealing with subject matter relating to self-harm. If you or a loved one are experiencing difficulties, we advise you to skip tonight's episode. Tonight, the nation is rocked as a young man takes his own life. Istanbul devolves into chaos and locals attack Syrian businesses. We will have the latest on the economy and an excellent Washington Post piece on Canal Istanbul and the pilots that govern the Bosphorus Strait. My guests tonight are activist Begüm Başdaş, who will be commenting on the incident in Istanbul, and Washington Post Istanbul Bureau Chief Kareem Fahim, who has authored an excellent piece on the less talked about side of Canal Istanbul and Bosphorus in general. Our first story, unfortunately, is a tragic one. Enes Kara, a 20-year-old medical student, rocked the nation as he ended his life on December 5th, 2021. Enes left his final words in a video, which went viral not only because of the tragedy itself, but the political climate. While attending college, Enes was housed in a dormitory operated by a religious sect. Though he did not believe in God, he had to adhere to the strict regimented life in the religious teachings of the sect dorms. He had expressed to his parents that he no longer wanted to reside in the dorms, but his father refused to relocate him. Coupled with the pressure from school and seeing no prospect nor future in the field of medicine in Turkey, Enes did the unthinkable. The loss of Enes Kara sparked a mass debate across Turkey. Many call religious dormitories to be abolished. Many want religious sects to be abolished altogether. And for once, it's not divided along party lines.
The nation was rocked this week when the harrowing final video of Enes Kara surfaced. Enes Kara recorded himself one last time before he took his own life on December 5th, 2021. While delivering his final words, the 20-year-old med student said that he was having to live in a religious sect's dorm while attending school. Among other pressures he felt from school, Enes mentioned that he had stopped believing in God and didn't want to adhere to the strict religious life in the dorms. He had spoken about this to his devout family, but to no avail. In his final moments, Enes explained, "You feel like your freedom is gone." The video went viral, taking over social media and drawing wide condemnation from both sides. Political division was visibly absent as both governing party and opposition supporters placed blame squarely on religious sects. According to Metropole Polling Company, only 12% of respondents and 20% of conservative ruling party AKP supporters approve of the practice of putting students up at religious dormitories. The political leaders lost no time in joining in on the conversation. Deva Party chair and former AKP Deputy Prime Minister Ali Babacan posted on Twitter, "Until this nation's youth can act according to their own volition and beliefs, until we secure their economic and freedom of thought, none of us will be free. I am deeply saddened. My condolences." Currently imprisoned former co-chair of the People's Democratic Party Selahattin Demirtas posted, "I am deeply saddened by Enes Kara's suicide. May God rest his soul. The issue is poverty. The issue is the government and the religious sects are ruling people through poverty. We together will change this regime." Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu posted, "For years, they have turned our children over to foundations, associations, and religious sect dormitories. This is why, for the first time in Istanbul municipality history, we have set up dormitories. I was devastated by the loss of Enes Kara. We will provide even more support for our youths. They will never again feel alone and hopeless." Inversely, the main opposition party, CHP chair Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, was uncharacteristically subdued. Kılıçdaroğlu posted on Twitter, "We have to be responsible in what content we share when it concerns painful materials concerning our youth. I understand those who are upset with me, but due to ethical reasons, I am not going to post about it. When the time comes, what must be done will be done. I understand the backlash, and I respect it."
Last Sunday, there was pandemonium in Istanbul's Esenyurt district as yet another clash between Turks and refugees breaks out. Last Sunday, what began as a pedestrian interaction devolved into a riot that saw Syrian businesses attacked. A couple of Turks asked for a cigarette from a couple of refugees. For whatever reason, the interaction sparked a fight amongst the group. As locals witnessed the fight, a mob gave chase to the refugees, chasing them into the local Syrian business. Discontent with the chase, the mob then took to breaking windows and damaging the store. We'll have activist Begüm Başdaş to comment on the incident, but let's go to that story first.
Kendi memleketine toprağına sahip çıkmaya geliyor, bunu dayıcılık yapıyorlar.
Aa 5 senede doğru düz meydana çıkıp alışveriş yapamıyoruz biz. Kokudan, pislikten durulmuyor orada yani.
Bunlara devlet önlem alsın. Önlem almıyorsa biz kendi önlemimizi alırız.
Kim? Bu da İstanbul. Bir çocuğu bıçak çıkarmışlar bizimkilere. Ben öyle bilmiyorum yani, başka bir şey de bilmiyorum yani. Adamlar sanki kendi memleketi. Bak adamlar şey yapıyor. Bizimkilere karşı geliyor, şey yapıyorlar. Kendi memleketine toprağına sahip çıkmaya geliyor, bunu dayıcılık yapıyorlar.
Adamların kimliği yok, burada geziyorlar.
Adam gelmiş köyden iş bulamıyor. Suriyeli pasaport iş buluyor. Bunlar iş bulamıyorlar şimdi. Düşük maaşa çalıştırıyorlar adamları, sigorta yapıyorlar. Sürekli burada geliyorlar, tacizde bulunuyorlar. İnsanlara işte hakarette bulunuyorlar. Her türlü şey yapıyorlar yani. Göndersin devlet bunları. Kalabalık geziyorlar, kılıçlarla dolaşıyorlar. Ülkesini savunamıyor. Bize kılıç çekiyor, silah çekiyor.
Yani bozmaya hakları yok.
Suriye olsun,
Irak olsun, insan olsun. Bizim kardeşimiz.
Suriyelilerin mahallesi tıklım.
İki çocuk kabul etmiş mahalle birbirine girmesin kardeşim.
Gece gündüz tıklım mahalleleri dolu. Devletten yardım alıyorlar. Belediyeden yardım alıyorlar. Her taraftan yardım alıyorlar. Burada Kürt vatandaşları da yardım almıyor.
Ya bu devletin zararı arkadaş. Biz kardeşe, insanlık kardeşliğine inanıyoruz arkadaş. Bizim için insan fark etmez. İnsanlar iki çocuk birbirine girmesin. Lütfen.
Kızlara saldırıyorlar. Bayanlara saldırıyorlar, yaşlılara saldırıyorlar. Bunlara devlet önlem alsın. Önlem almıyorsa biz kendi önlemimizi alırız. Sen nereye kaçıyorsun?
Güzel abicim, ben sana bir şey diyeceğim. Ama bir sigara için değer mi bu işin? Yani sizin vatandaşlar sigara için bir adamı dövüyorlar. Öyle bir şey var mı yani? Çok günah değil mi bu? Yani bilmiyorum, halimiz ne olacak bilmiyorum. Yok, ne olur biz çıkmayık buradan. Çok memnunuz, elhamdülillah, çok şükür. Yani biz buradan çıkmazız.
Joining me now, Medyascope Contributor Begüm Başdaş. Ms. Başdaş, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's our absolute pleasure. Now, you've been following the refugee situation in Turkey for quite some time. It appears that these attacks are becoming more and more frequent. Now, do you think this is an isolated incident, or is the anti-refugee sentiment in Turkey growing to some extent? And really, what we're all wondering is it organic, or is it being stoked by the political elite to some extent?
Well, in a sense, especially for the events that just happened in Esenyurt, of course, we can talk about the specificities of the Esenyurt. It is indeed a sociologically complex and an interesting place. Geographical circumstances and understandings do fuel such populist attacks. But in Turkey, I worry that we cannot isolate the attacks in Esenyurt to its special demography or any other context. There is in Turkey a systematic increase in the attacks against migrant and refugee communities across the country. I mean, about even less than a month ago, 3 Syrians were burned to death in Izmir. In Bayrampaşa, again this week, we have a 19-year-old Nail Al-Naif being stabbed to death. We see incidents of attacks against migrants and refugees in Ankara, Antep, Adana, Diyarbakır, all across the country. So it is hard to argue, it is hard to argue that these are isolated incidents, definitely. But we have to see these in a sense like the attacks in Ankara and Esenyurt are presented as like individual attacks. It's presented as these some mobs or one angry person is attacking, the refugees or, migrants. Or on the Esenyurt incident, there's allegedly it is a dispute over a cigarette, so these are the media, the authorities, all sorts of communities are trying to address and define these issues as individualized, something related to such as petty crimes. However, I think these are very organized attacks. These are organized attacks, not just by not because they are organized by a group or an organization. Like in Germany, we would say some of the attacks are organized by AfD, or in Greece, we used to talk of the Golden Dawn. It's not something like this I would speak of in Turkey yet, but they are organized because they stem from an ever-growing political discourse embraced by majority of the politicians and the media. So it is organized in that sense. So we need to look at the hate speech and targeting of refugees and migrants through that discourse of hate and discrimination and violence and so forth. In a sense, it is a chicken and an egg question, and it is a circular, issue in a sense. The public sentiments, the lack of transparency by the government on spending on migration, the lack of durable solutions, lack of integration policies, lack of all sorts of things create anxieties among the older comers or all other citizens. But the role of the politicians here is just to, address these issues. But what we see today is that they're actually instead stirring the fire instead of addressing and finding out, solutions that would consolidate everyone, I guess, in a sense. And this is, I think, absolutely important because people like, for example, Ümit Özdağ or İlay Aksoy or even Kılıçdaroğlu, the statements that they make actually are not to, create solutions that will be possible for the society at large, for the economy at large, but rather ad hoc, responses or targeting. For example, I think it was in one of the last few weeks, Ümit Özdağ, how could he, for example, enter a workplace of a migrant, ask for his documents randomly, and publicly broadcast it? From where does he get that authority without being questioned? İlay Aksoy and all other politicians target specifically individual migrants' shops and so on. So in that sense, when we look at it, yes, there is an understandable, concern within the society at large because of the lack of migration policies, because of lack of transparency by the authorities. But the role of the political organizations, the role of the politicians and all other influential figures has to be actually understanding where these anxieties come from, what are the needs of the society, how can we can get over these issues. But instead, they choose to stir more hatred, more violence. And at the end, it becomes a chicken and egg question, I guess, if that makes sense. I don't know.
I see. I think it does. And since we were on the topic of economy, of course, in Turkey, economy is everything. Politics is everything. And I don't think these two things can ever be separated. Now, for a little bit more context, Esenyurt is a socioeconomically, mixed district of Istanbul. We have heard from time to time, again, locals are sometimes unable to find jobs because the refugees work under the table for lower wages. And attacks seem to coincide with economic downturn, miraculously. Now, do you think this is primarily an economic problem at all?
Well, blaming migrants and refugees for economic demise is an old trick, in my opinion. And in the Turkey case, it's not merely related to the current downturn in a sense. So it's for decades all across the globe, migrants and refugees are blamed for unemployment and so forth, because it is always easier to point fingers to disadvantaged groups rather than looking at the core of the social and economic policies. Today, I saw some clip that was circulating on the social media. Some elderly landowner, the homeowner, was, attacking the door of his Syrian tenants with an axe. And allegedly, the argument was he wanted to increase the rent from 1,200 to 4,000, and the family didn't accept. So he wanted to evacuate them, and his method for evacuation of a contract of tenants with a contract was, tearing down his door with a axe. So, and for example, in another interview, actually done by Medyascope in Esenyurt, right after the incidents that happened this week, one person said migrants pay more for rents, so the rent prices increase. So the landowners aim to exploit the migrants by demanding outrageous prices. Again, this is a universal problem, not just particular to Turkey or Istanbul in general. I mean, it's also like I can't understand it as well. People don't want to rent their places to so-they called foreigners, but then they charge over prices. So this is true for employment. In Istanbul and Turkey is full of workshops and other sectors that exploit undocumented migrants working for nothing with no insurance and so forth. There has been hundreds of migrants and refugees killed or injured in workplace accidents. We don't even hear about them. We don't even know about these things because refugee lives, migrant lives are not even considered to be important to be noticed in terms of when they die or when they are injured. So the association of, so there is no regulation or oversight. The economy in many instances depend on these cheap, labor facilitated by the state itself. But the state is very abstract and it's too dangerous to address to, So for the public, it is too abstract and dangerous to address and question the state. So they attack and blame migrants. If refugees and migrants were registered, if they were given the right to work, if the state monitored and protected workers' lives in general, not just refugee workers, but the workers' rights in general, we would be looking at a different picture in that sense.
I see. Ms. Başdaş, thank you for commenting and thank you for taking the time to join us this week.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. In the economy this week, nothing catastrophic happened, which is really good news these days. As a matter of fact, for once, we might actually have a glimmer of hope. Unemployment numbers are rock steady for the final quarter of 2021 at 11.2%, which is not great, but it's better than it going up. However, this week, the Ministry of Treasury and Finance, Murat Nebati, decides to extend an olive branch to the Turkish Industry and Business Association, perhaps signaling good days to come.
The Turkish Statistical Institute reports unemployment numbers on the final quarter of 2021. According to the data released, despite the rising inflation numbers in the same quarter, unemployment remained steady at 11%, while the employment total remained at 46%. This week, Ministry of Treasury and Finance, Murat Nebati, signaled an attempt at reconciliation between the government and the Turkish Industry and Business Association, or TÜSİAD, as he sat down for a meeting with the board on Wednesday. Previously, President Erdogan had harsh words for TÜSİAD after the organization had published an open letter critical of the government, calling on the Erdogan administration to return to orthodox fiscal policies and cease the lowering of interest rates. President Erdogan had fired back at TÜSİAD, saying, "TÜSİAD and its kin, I am talking to you. You cannot fight us. We know who you are. You are trying to overthrow this government so you can install a government you can exploit." But this week, there was a more jovial mood after the meeting with Minister Nebati. TÜSİAD chairman of the board, Szymon Kozłowski, made a statement after the meeting. "We discussed the effects of the steps taken. We shared our findings with the minister. The lines of communication were very open, and it was a sincere meeting. We believe that we will continue these sessions with the minister. We shared our views on the inflation, and we believe that there will be a serious fight against it." Meanwhile, President Erdogan's recent tour of amends in the Gulf region appears to have paid off some. After a decade of cold relations with the UAE, President Erdogan had hosted Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Al Nahyan in the presidential palace in Ankara last November. It appears now that the meeting may have been more consequential than previously thought. As this week, in an interview with the Financial Times, Abu Dhabi Development Holding Chairman of the board, Mohammed Hassan Al Suwaidi, said that it was a great time to invest in Turkey. Al Suwaidi stated, "My favorite thing about Turkey is the location. A delivery reaches Germany in 12 hours, and it has a population of 84 million. Turkey is a power center for industry and has great logistical capacity. We are definitely interested in logistics. We are also interested in agriculture, and there are opportunities there."
Our main story tonight is an insane mega project that has been taking shape in Turkey for some time. Now we're talking about Canal Istanbul, a proposed secondary strait to be dug next to the natural one. And by that, of course, I mean the Bosphorus. It has supporters, it has detractors, and it has been making headlines for years. But a less talked about aspect of the story is how do these massive tankers that traverse these straits actually do it without causing massive ecological harm? We will have Washington Post Istanbul Bureau Chief Kareem Fahim joining us, but let's go to that video first and let's get to know Istanbul Canal and the Bosphorus Strait.
The Bosphorus is a narrow 31-kilometer-long strait that separates Asia from Europe. Every day, 17 million people transit this strait that connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, down to the Aegean, and finally into the Mediterranean. The Bosphorus is one of the world's most economically and strategically important passages, along with the Panama Canal, Gibraltar, and the Suez. And for President Erdogan, it alone simply will not do. Enter Canal Istanbul, a proposed mega project that is as divisive as it is bold. The project aims to cut through 45 kilometers of agriculture, residential areas, and woodlands to form a second strait from the Black Sea to the Marmara. The stated purpose of the project is to reduce heavy maritime traffic in the Bosphorus as it hosts 8,000 crude oil tankers each year, every single one of them a potential environmental catastrophe. Like the 1979 Independente incident, where a crude oil carrier collided with a freighter and burned for 27 days, spilling 64,000 tons of crude oil into the sea. President Erdogan is the primary backer of this mind-boggling project, and despite heavy opposition from both political leaders and Istanbulites, he is dead set on accomplishing this monumental goal. Erdogan is famously quoted saying, "We will build the canal in spite, whether you like it or not." According to the polling done by Metropol, the support for the project is fairly down the party lines, with nearly 90% support from President Erdogan's party base. But the project is still widely unpopular, with 37% of total respondents being for and 48% being against the project. Overall, the canal garners criticism from all sides. Environmentalists warned that mixing the currents from the Black Sea and Marmara could have devastating ecological impacts. Infrastructure experts state that the project cost of $12 billion for the canal is highly unrealistic. In addition, the project would eliminate Lake Durusu, a major source of fresh water for Istanbul, a city of 16 million. If and until Canal Istanbul is completed, those keeping the Bosphorus safe are pilots. Specialized captains who take control of passing ships and drive them through the strait. 60% of passages from the Bosphorus are commanded by pilots, who significantly reduce collisions and guard the already very delicate Bosphorus Strait.
Joining me now to comment, Washington Post Istanbul Bureau Chief Kareem Fahim, who has authored an excellent piece on a less well-known aspect concerning the Bosphorus Strait. Pilots. Pilots are expert captains who ferry massive ships through Istanbul straits to prevent less experienced crew from colliding in the treacherous sea. Mr. Fahim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
Our absolute pleasure. Now, Mr. Fahim, can you tell us a little bit about your article? What made you want to pursue the story, and what was your journey getting to the story?
Sure. I think the initial idea for the story came up during one of my brainstorming sessions with my colleague Zeynep Karataş, and as I recall it, I think she had been at a dinner with her family the evening before, and her father had told her this sort of nice story about swimming in the Bosporus when he was a teenager. I think he grew up along the water, and the story of these pilots who would go by in the pilot boats and would occasionally take the kids places along the shore, to school, or they would just pick them up. And it sounded nice and idyllic and nostalgic, and we decided to try and see whether we could make a story out of it. And I think at the time that this was a while ago, this was last spring, and at the time we were discussing the sort of implications of what had happened in the Suez with the Ever Given, that massive container ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days. And, we were looking for a nice feature story, and I didn't know anything about the pilots. And so we decided to try and find some of them and talk to them about their work and talk to them about the Bosphorus. And initially we had wanted to ask them about what was happening in the Suez, but it took a long time, frankly, to find these people. And by the time we did, it wasn't as much of an issue. And they, as I recall, they didn't really want to talk about it all that much, for whatever reason. Maybe because it could have, from their perspective, could have said something about the conduct of the pilots in another waterway. Whatever, they were much more sort of intent on talking about their job, what they do, their training, and the sort of particular quirks and hazards in the Bosphorus. So that's how we started. We initially we made a request to the government to talk to the pilots who work for the state as pilots for ships transiting the Bosphorus. That took a little while, and so while we waited, we reached out to the Pilots Association, which is made up of pilots in the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles and some of the other bays and ports, and we found it was easier to talk to pilots working for private companies, those pilots and the state pilots that we spoke to were all, sort of gregarious and full of stories and very happy to talk about their work. And I think haven't been interviewed that much. So we're, just really sort of expansive and generous with their time. So that's sort of how we did it.
I see. And could you tell us a little about these pilots? Who are these pilots? What's their training? Where do they come from? What do they do?
Yeah, I mean, the ones we spoke to had sort of varied backgrounds and different reasons for wanting to get into the profession. I'm trying to remember what the main character in our story said his motivations were. Some of them said that they had wanted to travel the world and they saw, being on ships as a way to do that. They all go through this program in the Maritime University. They're all required to have, several years of, apprenticeship and then piloting and, before reaching, the status of chief pilot, for instance. I don't remember exactly how many hours they're required to tally before they reach that. But yeah, and I think the private companies are a fairly recent development, like in the last few decades, and up until I think maybe the 60s or 70s, it was all sort of a state-run system, and then these private companies started to emerge. They're not. I was hoping to hear them say sort of romantic things about the work and what it's like being on the water all the time, and they're not. They're stoic, and it's pretty tough work, and it's tough work beginning from when you head out onto the pilot's ship towards these tankers, and they're forced to climb these. I described it a little bit in the story. These sort of wooden rope ladders that look, pretty rickety, and some of them are, some of these tankers are enormous. And so they're bounding up these very long distances in, suboptimal conditions. And during winter, when we went, it was a fairly warm day, but I think during winter it's pretty treacherous, and they go up during the rain and during storms. And so it starts with that. And then on larger tankers, that's only the beginning of it. And then they're going up several very long staircases before they reach the crew. And then, there's just a bunch of, there's all these, I think, as I described in the story, there are 12 course changes in the Bosporus. So they have to be mindful of that. There are all these currents. There, to begin with, there's a current and a counter current in the Bosporus. And then there are particular spots along the waterway where there are these other nasty currents. And then you have the seasonal winds. So they don't, all of that's to say they don't have time to sort of romanticize this experience. They're sort of getting in, getting out, enjoying their days off very much, and just trying to be vigilant.
I see. But suffice it to say that these men know what they're doing. They're expert pilots, yes?
I mean, I'm not a pilot, but the ones we met with were certainly very knowledgeable, cognizant of the history of their profession, cognizant of the perils. All of them can recite all of the accidents that have happened on the waterway over the years. As I described in the story, there's in the Pilots Association in Kadıköy, all the walls are decorated with, these enormous pictures of horrific accidents, and ships on fire, and pictures of pilots who have died in the past, and so this history is sort of very, very present for them, and so yeah, that informs their experience and that vigilance that I described. And as far as I could tell, they knew what they were doing, and they were really the message I think they were trying to get across was that it is much, much safer for ships in the Bosporus when they have a pilot on board. And I've read reports with statistics in them that say, something like 90% of the accidents that occur do so when there's not a pilot on board. I'm not sure whether that's accurate, but I think that's right. So, yeah.
I see. And I know we have to let you go because you're on a deadline, but last real quick. Now,
okay.
I think we've established that these men are competent pilots and they know what they're doing. And being an Istanbul boy myself, I've kind of sailed the Bosphorus back in my day once or twice. Not expertly, but...
And women, too,
and women.
By the way. I think there are female pilots as well.
Absolutely, my mistake. And I know that these are treacherous seas. I mean, like I said, I'm not an experienced pilot, but of course, this being Turkey, we can't talk about Bosphorus these days without talking about politics. And what do these men and women think about Istanbul Canal?
I'm sure they have opinions on the Istanbul Canal. They were not, just in terms of the timeline of reporting this story, I think we started thinking about it in March, last March, and I think it was the next month. It was like in April. A bunch of things happened while we were reporting. One was the pandemic, which delayed the reporting, and several of the pilots that we were interviewing got COVID, and at least one was hospitalized. So that was part of the reporting. But the other thing that happened was, if you remember, there was that letter by the admirals regarding the Montreux Convention that annoyed the government and ended up becoming this huge deal. And And I think with that in mind, none of the pilots wanted to talk about the canal because it was too political. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think it would have been perfectly fine for either the pilots for the private companies or the state pilots, had they wanted to tell me they thought the canal was a terrific idea, and there wouldn't have been any blowback for maybe from their peers, but none of them did. When we would ask about it, they would sort of go back to, we keep this thing very safe. And so that's one of the arguments, that's, as that's one of the arguments that the government has made in arguing for the canal, this idea that, there's always peril to Istanbul from the Bosporus. And then, when you talk to maritime safety experts, they don't. There's a real debate about whether a man-made canal is any more safe, for a variety of reasons that I'm not really expert enough to get into. But again, I think because especially at that time that we were talking to them, it was so politically sensitive, nobody sort of really ventured into that. But we're very clear that they're very good at keeping ships safe in the Bosphorus.
We should hope so, us all Istanbulites.
Yes.
Mr. Fahim, thank you for being able to join us and let us know about your piece. And for the folks at home who'd like to do a deep dive into the story, it's available down in the description. I highly recommend it. It's a great read. Mr. Fahim.
Thank you.
Thank you again. And
thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure, and we hope to have you back in the future. And with that, that's it for us in This Week in Turkey. I have been Murat, Türsan, and thank you for joining us.
Türkiye'nin sivil, bağımsız, özgür ve çoğulcu bir medya ortamına ihtiyacı var. Medyascope, 20 Ağustos 2015'te bu ihtiyacı karşılamak üzere yola çıktı. Ama yolumuz uzun. Bu yolculukta bize Patreon veya YouTube'un katıl butonu üzerinden katkıda bulunabilirsiniz. Destek verin, sizinle güçlenelim.